So we start our story with the fall of Rome, right? So this happened in roughly 476 AD. But of course, as with all things, it didn't just fall overnight. As the saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day, and in the same way, it wasn't destroyed in a day, right? So what happened over several centuries was that they end up being like decadence, right? So basically, the Roman elites end up basically, relying on slaves like to do all the work for them. They just party, and so basically like they kind of lost faith in the empire, and increasingly they end up relying on Germanic barbarians, to basically fill their military ranks. And obviously, if you're basically importing what are essentially mercenaries, right? Mercenaries might be very good soldiers, but at the same time they have no loyalty to like kind of to the kingdom or to the empire that they're trying to defend, and so they end up basically just having like loyalty to the commander that they have. And so if they decide, right, we're gonna just go AWOL, then the men also go AWOL, right? So this is something which you kind of found towards the end of the Roman Empire, which is that many of the kind of like Germanic tribes, which the Romans were kind of like using to fill their armies, they end up turning on the Romans, right? And on top of that as well, you had like the Huns that were moving through, like Central and Eastern Europe, and this caused a lot of different kind of demographic displacement and stuff. So you have the Slavs moving here, the Germans moving there, etc. So it's all kind of just a big mess and stuff, right? But what ends up filling the void, what ends up kind of finally officially getting rid of the Western Roman Empire is that these Germanic tribes end up basically conquering vast swathes of the empire, right? So when the Romans withdraw from Britain, you end up having the Anglo-Saxons who end up coming across, and they end up settling there. So England means the land of the Angles. So Angleland, England, etc., etc. Then you have the Visigoths who moved to Spain and stuff. Then you have, I believe it's the Ostrogoths or something. I can't remember the exact name, but I've got it on the screen now. And they end up taking over Italy. And then you end up having the Franks, right? So the Franks end up having a territory called Austrasia, right? So Austrasia means the Eastern realm, right? So Austria today in German means, it means Osterreich, which is like Eastern realm. So this is kind of like an Eastern realm as such, right? And so these Franks end up over time, over various different kings, and they end up and various different conquests, they end up expanding more and more and more until we get to King Charles the Great, right? Or Charlemagne, as he's more commonly known. So Charlemagne, he became the king of the Franks in 768 AD, and he, through various different military campaigns, as we can see on the map here, he ends up taking over more and more territory, and kind of building on and consolidating this empire that his forefathers had kind of built for him, right? So in 1774, he ends up taking over Lombardy. In 1778, he ends up taking over the Spanish March, which we've discussed in our video on Catalonia, which definitely check that out. So this is where he basically takes over the area which is now Catalonia. From 777 to 797, he ends up taking over Saxony. So this is this is his biggest campaign. So Saxony is basically where the Saxon came from, of course, and so there were many different like pagan groups here. And so one of the things he wanted to do was to kind of just crush them, because obviously people got to conquer and stuff, right? But also one of the things he wanted to do was to Christianize them as well, right? So this is a very long and very bloody war. Basically, what he ended up doing there was akin to what we say called ethnic cleansing. He ended up taking a bunch of people here, moving it there, and then settling new people in here and just massacring people, etc., etc. Really terrible stuff, right? And this is often what you kind of see in like earlier times. Like we kind of think of like ethnic cleansing as like a new phenomenon. In actual fact, people have been doing it since time immemorial, right? But anyway, so this was a very long campaign that took like 20 years to subject Saxony. And in 788, he ends up taking over Bavaria and Carinthia, right? So on Christmas Day, 800 AD, he ends up being crowned as the emperor by the Pope, right? Now, the Pope and the different kings of Europe had a lot of clashes during this time, so it wasn't a kind of clear thing where the Pope was in charge, or like the kings were in charge, etc., etc. They kind of kept like fighting for control. So in this instance here, the Pope was at a lower point, and so he basically tried to bolster his own legitimacy by crowning Charlemagne as the emperor, right? Then also Charlemagne basically used this as well to his advantage by basically being like, well, okay, cool. Like he wasn't even too bothered about it, because it didn't mean that he got extra territory. He already controlled all these things, but it was a nice kind of gesture, yeah. And so as a result of this, he ended up becoming the emperor. So this is the Carolingian Empire, this is the Frankish Empire. So what ended up happening, right? How comes there isn't one of these things today? Well, this is basically because of a strange quirk they have with regard to like inheritance laws, right? So basically what would be the case is that if someone died, what would happen is that their land and their territory would end up being split between their sons, right? So Charlemagne was lucky enough only to have like one major son and stuff, right? So he ended up like inheriting like that all the kingdom. But then that person ended up having three sons, right? And these three sons, in 840, so at the death of like Louis the Pious, so you had Charlemagne, then you have Louis the Pious, and so he dies in 1840. So there ends up being a civil war, which ravages the kingdom for 3 years. And in 843 AD, you end up having the Treaty of Verdun. Now, the Treaty of Verdun basically divides the empire three ways. And if you look on the map here, this is the division, right? Now, if you know anything about European geography at all, like if you know about the different linguistic groups, you know about the different, just the physical geography, like there in terms of mountains and rivers and stuff, it's quite clear that the western like part of this, West Francia makes some level of sense. East Francia maybe makes some level of sense. This middle kingdom here, this middle Francia, makes absolutely no sense at all, right? So by the time the Carolingian Empire finally collapses in 888 AD, what ends up happening is you end up having West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia, and there ends up being different wars and different like kind of territory being gained and different territory being lost by the different kings and stuff. But what ends up happening over time is end up being a consolidation of like these different groups. So West Francia in 987 AD ends up becoming the Kingdom of France, and this ends up having the capital in Paris, and this is how we have the modern state of France coming from, right? However, in 855 AD, Middle Francia ends up being split between the Kingdom of Italy and the Kingdom of Lotharingia. I think I pronounced that correctly, right? So so Lotharingia is here, and the Kingdom of Italy is obviously kind of in what's today like northern Italy, right? So you can kind of see like how the idea of France and eventually what becomes the idea of Italy starts to kind of take root. And this affair lasts until 959 AD. And also East Francia in 962 AD ends up essentially becoming the Holy Roman Empire, right? So this is the beginning of, as Voltaire said, the empire that was, is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? And it's just a kind of a cluster of multiple different competing kingdoms of just a complete mess. But the thing is, this is kind of the central building blocks for what we think of as a German identity, of an Italian identity, and a French identity. So what we're going to basically say now we've kind of covered the basic kind of history of it, is how would this have gone different, right? Kind of like, first of all, what would have had to have gone different for this not to have collapsed, right? And second of all, how would like world history have been completely different if this collapse hadn't have happened, right? So if they all stayed united, how would the history of Europe and world history have been changed? That's what we're going to get into now.